board member is kind of like a firefighter. You expect them to go into the burning building, not run out with everybody else.
Today's guest, Betsy Atkins, has done something no previous Enter the Boardroom guest has done. She has sat on more than 38 public company boards, been through 17 IPOs, and has done it all while running 3 companies of her own.
Listen to your stomach, because you go into the boardroom and in the first meeting, the CEO is unhinged with rage and yelling at his compensation share, demanding this huge compensation package. I called my board members and said, we need an emergency board meeting.
She co-founded Ascend Communications and took it to a $23 billion acquisition by Lucent. She has written 2 books on what happens inside the boardroom, Behind Boardroom Doors and Be Board Ready.
I started to think that all board members should take the Hippocratic oath to do no harm to the patient.
Welcome to Enter the Boardroom, the podcast for boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, home to the Enter the Boardroom community, the destination for serving and aspiring board directors. Betsy, welcome to Enter the Boardroom.
Delighted to be with you and your listeners.
Betsy, you co-founded Ascend Communications in 1989. You're on your own board from the start with venture capital directors around the table. Curious to hear what that experience taught you about what a board should and should not be doing.
Ascend Communications wasn't my first company that I co-founded. Earlier in my career, I co-founded a company named Intraland. And there, our venture investors were a little challenging. And so I started to think that all board members should take the Hippocratic oath to do no harm to the patient. And I learned at Ascend what good venture capital board members could be. And where they were especially valuable was in spotting where the leadership team was running out of ability. Company had grown faster than the skills and experience of the founding CEO and the leadership team. And they were very good at helping understand that since our growth rate was so fast and we were going public after 2 years, it was clear that the CEO we had wasn't going to be the right public company CEO. So forward building the team and coaching the founder into a productive role, which is really hard to do. No founder happily rotates out of CEO to a different role, and then making the call when it wasn't, his behavior wasn't constructive and we had to make a different change. The other great thing that the board understood was how to forward build manufacturing at scale. They had been there, they had done that. We had somebody from the telecommunications industry, a gentleman named Roger Evans. So he'd scaled through high volume manufacturing at quality. So we were very fortunate in seeing what good constructive questions, active listening were. So we were lucky there.
Take me back to that first board. You said a little challenging. Can you expand on that?
Oh, the first board, Intraland, yeah, it was tough. We had first-time venture capitalists who didn't understand the role between the, oversight and operations, right? Management leads and operates. And if you lose confidence in management, you have to make a change. But you can't be micromanaging because you don't operate. You don't own the delivery of the key metrics of whether it's revenue growth, market share, volume production, whatever it might be. And they were also not very effective at coaching. Nobody does well when you're publicly humiliated or publicly chastised. So learning how to give constructive criticism in a way where people can absorb it. When you're on the receiving end, you say, there's a better way to do this. If you're not berating me, I'm probably going to listen better.
So I guess for board members listening, it's an interesting challenge of how do you help an executive course correct without putting them into that fight or flight mode? What was it that the board at Ascend did better on that front?
I think it's what every great board or leader does. You get the best out of people when you figure out where is their superpower, how you can help them grow, how you can maximize their potential. Everybody responds to that, whether you're the CEO, a functional leader, or a board member. And, people do well when they're prepared as well. Nobody, loves to be surprised, especially in a room full of people.
Can you give me a sense of what superpowers look like? I imagine you must have archetypes when you're now sitting on boards working with the executive teams. What are the sorts of superpowers that you look for?
In an early stage company, if it's a technology company, the superpower that you most frequently see is the product visionary, the innovator, the entrepreneur. Now the USA idiom phrase is 6 nines, 6 days a week, 9 hours a day minimum. Grit, tenacity, drive. Great startups don't happen, 5 days a week, 9 to 5. It's just not what they are. The other key superpower is always go to market, because it's the line organization, right? Either you build it or you sell it or you manufacture it. The other parts of the organization are overhead, right? You need some process, you need some infrastructure, but, great companies are driven by line executives with, great strength in, of a relevant part of the company.
Let's move on to talk about your lessons from the first part of your board journey. If you could go back now to those first 5 or 6 board seats, what is it that you know now? What did you get wrong that you would not get wrong today?
What I have learned is, how key the active listening is to be able to decode what's said and what's not said, how to give feedback in a constructive way, whether it's how to disagree and raise a different viewpoint, how to, get your colleagues to make decisions in a timely situation if there's a big issue or a crisis, how to, anticipate what could be an opportunity or a challenge and activate your CEO and leadership team to consider those topics in a collaborative way, because without building trust, nobody is going to bring you the transparency of what are their real challenges.
I want to move on to talk about your time on the board of HealthSouth, because it's an absolutely fascinating story, and you've written about the 16 days on the governance failure from the inside. I want you to take our listeners back to March 2003, when you joined the board, specifically because the original board had come short on its oversight duties, and you are there as a reformer, and then 16 days in, the FBI walked through the door. What were you actually seeing in those 16 days that, in retrospect, you were not reading clearly enough?
The story is instructive for everybody. The specific circumstance, HealthSouth, a public company, $4 billion in revenue, had ambulatory hospitals, 55,000 employees, 300 hospitals. The founder had been accused by the Security and Exchange Commission, the financial regulator, of front-running with insider information and trading ahead of the market, that the reimbursement from our equivalent of the National Institute of Health was going to be a lower rate. They did an internal investigation, but it was no good, because the CEO who was being investigated identified the board members himself, so it's not independent. If I pick you to investigate me, I'm not going to pick I'm picking someone who's going to give me a good report card. And the CEO hired the outside law firm. So, that's not independent either. So the process was no good. Our court that oversees all businesses is called the Chancery Court. They rejected the investigation as being non-independent. I was brought in as the chair to redo it. And when I got there, I had been there a couple of times before joining the board, and it felt wrong. It felt like everybody was fearful, everybody was nervous, everybody was anxious. The whole culture, you walk through the halls and it just, your intuition as, your fight or flee intuition, those little hairs at the back of your neck are like, wow, something is off here. So first of all, listen to your stomach, because you go into the boardroom and in the first meeting, the CEO is unhinged, with rage and yelling at his compensation share, demanding this huge compensation package, but he's invaded his space. He's standing over him. He's yelling at him like saliva is coming out of the guy's mouth. And, it's pretty horrifying. So, and the leadership team is so nervous. You shake hands with the general counsel. His hand is wet. The CFO is perspiring profusely. So if it looks wrong, it is wrong. And it turned out the FBI raided with 8 teams, confiscated the computers, and the company trading on the New York Stock Exchange was halted. And I was the chair, and I called my board members and said, we need an emergency board meeting. And they said, no, we don't. Everything's okay. No, everything is definitely not okay. You need to get on the call, every one of you, at 5:00, and don't bring your lawyer. You have to come alone, because in the U.S., your privilege of what you're saying, being retained as private is broken if you have outsiders in the boardroom. Your confidentiality can be broken in a lawsuit. So anyhow, that was my stepping in. And the journey, the learning was how you navigate a board of individuals who had no public board background or experience. They were all kind of first timers, and they were not crisis ready, and they didn't process as a team. So how do you knit, a team out of people who are inexperienced, polarized, and, not ready to deal with a crisis?
So that sounds like, for a board member listening to this, one of the things they should make sure when they're looking around that boardroom is that they have got people with experience of a crisis should the unexpected hit. What does that look like to you? What is good criteria for experience of a crisis look like on a board?
I think that you have hit the single most important point on board service is courage and the ability to be decisive in a crisis, because your board is kind of, often not that engaged when things are going well, right? You're in a boat and you rise with the rising tide. Where your board is needed was when something goes wrong. You have to replace your CEO. There's a catastrophe. There's, a ransomware breach. Something of a crisis nature occurs. You're in the food business. You have to do a recall. You've poisoned people. Things go wrong in companies. And what you really look for, in my opinion, is character, because everybody's going to have a great resume. But what you're looking for is how you will do when things go wrong. Will you lean in? Will you be constructive? Will you be calm? A board member is kind of like a firefighter. You expect them to go into the burning building, not run out with everybody else. That's your role. You're a fiduciary, for the shareholders to problem solve when something is happening that you weren't expecting.
How do you screen for that? Is that a question of referencing? Is it a question of the interviews? So where you're asking them to share experiences where they have demonstrated these behaviors? Like, what are you looking for specifically?
I look for, in any prospective board member,
sorry, let me just be clear on that. To validate that they do have that decisiveness in a crisis moment.
Yes. When I'm trying to validate that and I speak to a colleague or a prospective colleague, I'm looking to find out what have they done themselves. Because if you've only ever been part of a team, you haven't made the decisions yourself. If you've only been, forever, you've spent your 34 years at, IBM or Nestle or Royal Dutch Shell going up management, you've been part of a big team. You probably haven't made the decision by yourself. What can you show and share where you made the decision, where you created something, you fixed a problem, you built something? What did you do? I want to know, how have you done in adversity? What are the problems you've solved? What were the messiest problems? Whatever they were. Could have been an HR issue. It could have been, a functional issue on your team. How are you at problem solving? Because problem solving requires decisiveness. It requires dealing with uncomfortable things. It requires speed, because a problem solved 3 years later is not a problem solved. Making no decision for 1 week, 3 weeks, 5 months, you're part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And no decision is part of the problem, not the solution. So I look for those things.
Okay. Now, you resigned when it became clear on the HealthSouth board that you were not covered by your directors and officers' insurance. And the other board members did not resign, and they tried to persuade you to stay. Was that courage, or what was their thinking, and where did your perspectives differ?
So in the United States, director and officer insurance and indemnification protect you. Because the company had gone into a very specific financial state of insolvency, when you go into the zone of insolvency, you personally are responsible. And so that means you're going to lose all your savings and you're going to lose your house and whatever you have. And the other directors had been there for that same group for over 20 years. They had all made, likely more than $35 million apiece. They had presided over these problems. And it turned out they had had 5 chief financial officers who had cooked the books. I looked at that and I said, wow, this is a level of risk that, as the chair, is going to have a huge bullseye on me to get through. And America is uniquely, in a very bad way, a litigious country. 2.4% of our gross domestic product, which, what are we now? Are we round numbers, 20 trillion? We're the largest single economy. 2.4% is lawyers suing people and confiscating things. So, I don't know that I would not have resigned on a European board. I would not have resigned on, an Asian board, a Chinese, a Japanese, an Indian board. But in the U.S., where I wasn't the fraud person and they were supposed to be overseeing against fraud. And when you saw the intensity of the broken culture, how scared everybody was, how dysfunctional they were, how unable they were to make a decision and cohere and process, I said, wow, this is a train wreck. So before leaving, I did get them through 3 major key hurdles. I convened everybody every day for an emergency meeting. They had to make one decision a day. First decision is should we fire our CEO or not? You would obviously say, oh, fire the CEO, but no. Then you have to pay him a $35 million severance package. Maybe we should give him a leave of absence. Next day, next decision. Should we hire a restructuring firm to help us, in this zone of insolvency? And I had done the work to find all the best restructuring firms, boil it down to 2, make a subcommittee of myself and 2 others to interview the 2 best restructuring firms and make a decision to recommend one to the board. Make that decision. Next day, should we hire a banker to get us through, bridge financing? We're in the zone of insolvency. We can't pay our employees. And then that means you have to pay 55,000 employees. Make that one decision. So I found by distilling down the most urgent priority decision each day and only one decision and offering clear options to the board, we marched through it for 16 days. So by the time I rotated out, we were on a more stable footing. But knowing that America is litigious and it's a cancer on our country, you knew that there was going to be an avalanche of lawsuits. And that was just something I wasn't prepared to face, a decade and a half of lawsuits trying to confiscate your savings.
Sounds like an incredibly stressful situation. Has that experience changed how you diligence new opportunities as a board member where you knew there was some hair on it going in, but perhaps hadn't fully appreciated how much hair? Like, did you reflect on what you might have done differently before taking that on, and has that factored into how you look at new opportunities now?
I think that yes, it has, and the most important thing is having a good connect and chemistry with the CEO and the board colleagues. So in terms of diligencing a board, it would be a red flag for me if none of the board members had ever served on public boards, out of 11 other people, and you're the 12th. It would also be a red flag if your sense of the CEO's transparency and your alignment with their vision and their growth, if you don't feel very excited and passionate and confident in the vision and the leadership, you shouldn't join that board. If you're coming in, via an activist, that's different, right? You come in with a remit to look at how can the board improve its operations and, how, is it the CEO? Is it the strategy? Is it the leadership? Your mindset is, the company is underperforming. How can I understand this and be helpful? But, in general, I think assessing the talent around the board table, because that's who you're serving with. Can you learn from them? Can you grow with them? Can you help them? Assessing your CEO and the leadership team, for your conviction about their leadership.
Chairs, CEOs, and founders have public presence. NEDs often don't. That invisibility limits your influence, reduces your inbound opportunities, and makes it harder to be considered for the roles that would genuinely stretch you. The Enter the Boardroom community gives you a platform and a peer group to build visible authority. Through thought leadership, community engagement, and access to senior board practitioners, you become someone the market knows and trusts. Visit etb.newroll.com to find out more. Let's move on and talk about AI, which is a topic boards everywhere are wrestling with. You chair the Google Cloud Executive Advisory Board and have written on AI governance. Curious to hear, what are the most sophisticated boards you are seeing doing differently with respect to AI, both in how they are seizing the opportunity and managing the risk?
So I think that the most important thing to think about with AI is to understand how it's different from, traditional software that everybody knows about and has used for years, right? Everybody knows about a system of record from SAP or Oracle. They know about a customer management system from Salesforce. They know about, trouble ticketing and problem solving from ServiceNow. So everybody understands all that stuff. That's traditional software. And that is what is called deterministic or rules-based. So if I have a payroll, I have rules how much I'm going to pay you. That's deterministic. Large language models and AI are probabilistic. So if I'm using AI for a chat bot in my call center, it's going to do a personalized view of me. It'll know my purchasing history, and it will say the next best offer Betsy will like. Like if you watch Netflix, it offers you another TV show series that you're probably going to like based on your history. So that's probabilistic. So you have to be careful in understanding what's a use case that's deterministic and what's a use case that's probabilistic. So using agentic AI for your payroll system, no. You don't probably want to pay someone what they might receive. You want to pay them what they're owed. So first of all, foundational understanding. Everybody understands oversight of cyber. We went through that and we all, understand how to do that. AI is different. It constantly iterates and self-learns, just like it learned what TV shows I want or what books I read, or, if I bought blouses with collars, now I want one that's white. So what you need to think about with AI is the best use cases. And to do governance, the risks are different than the normal governance of cyber. So, for example, one of the big frontier large language models, about OpenAI, about Google's Gemini, about XAI Grok, about Anthropic's Claude. So Anthropic wrote this article called Agentic Misalignment. And I wrote this little summary when I read it. It was 24 pages. It was really kind of a deep article, and it tests all 16 of the biggest large language models. And if you have an agentic deployment, the agent is going to read everything to learn. Because if I'm giving you an e-commerce offer, I've looked at your purchasing history. I've looked at your payment history. I've looked at the things that you have done in the past that would predict the future. And so I have to have access to all your systems in the company. But because I'm agentic and I'm a machine learning algorithm, I keep trying to learn, so I go and I don't obey the rules. I burrow around and I look in the other systems I'm not supposed to look at. I look at payroll. I look at your private email. And in the test scenario that Anthropic published called Agentic Misalignment, it tests 16 of these, and every single time if you do something that threatens to deinstall the agent, it goes rogue and it blackmails you and it does hostile things. So you need to understand your oversight has to be different, because in deploying agentic technology, you need to have the traceability, the explainability, the observability. You have to know that the machine learning algorithm, it drifts. So you have to reset it. So it's a different oversight structure, and you need to learn to do it properly, because agentic software is going to be deployed in everybody's company, and it already is. And some companies are doing a spectacular job, and they are leading their peers where they're doing it. And I think everybody is going to deploy it in varying degrees this calendar year.
Have you been involved with any boards where you've struggled to get the executive to engage with AI?
All boards struggle to engage with it for the CEO. You get the exceptional ones, like our CEO at Wynn Resorts, where, he's extremely tech savvy. The exceptional CEO, former CEO, now chair at Schneider Electric, Jean-Pascal Tricoire, who totally reset the company by leaning into tech. But they're all going to be reticent and don't understand it. The key thing that we've done that's been the best, so for example, at Atlas Air Cargo, which is a $6 billion, the largest air cargo company in the world. We're going to bring our CEO, our board members, and our leadership team to MIT for a 3-day course so we can demystify it, get comfortable with it. understand, get people using the technology because you can now use it. You can do programming with natural language, the way you speak. Write me a program on the best Chinese restaurants in this price bracket that are close to where I live within 20 kilometers. And it's done.
So I think that's really interesting, using that hands-on experience that you, the board, the independents, as well as the exec do together so that everybody is on the same page. What else have you found effective as a way to get those executives engaging and cascading it through the organizations more effectively?
I was lead director at a company named Home Depot Supply. It was about $8 billion. And when I joined, because I have a tech background as my home industry, and I always thought going on different boards was fascinating, and I always want to because tech is the kind of connective tissue. I had mentioned this phrase of, we should be thinking about, digital transformation a little more. And I looked in the boardroom and I said, oh boy, everybody just looked at me like buzzword. What the hell does that mean? That's nonsense. You're spouting phrases. And I said, we have an opportunity here. And so we started to bring people in, once every other board meeting during lunch, which was, in the boardroom. For a half an hour, we would have an outside speaker do a lunch and learn. So we talked about cyber breach, and we brought in the world's leading expert on what do you do when you're breached? How do you mitigate it? How do you get back online? So, you go through a little small topic that's interesting and well presented. And then on the bigger topic of digital transformation, since, this wasn't a theme that people understood comfortably and confidently, I said, instead of going out for a board dinner, why don't we stay in the training room and we'll have 3 companies come in and present to us and to the exec leadership team. So we had McKinsey, we had Boston Consulting Group, and we had Bain come in. And the way we did it was at 4:30, at kind of the end of the board meeting, we went to the training room and we had the first one come in. They all had the same remit to describe digital transformation and what that could mean to our company. How does that relate? So there was a half an hour presentation, and then we had a half an hour in between when we all talked about it. And, the first time it was said, people were like, I'm not sure. What's that really mean? And there was a little discussion, for about a half an hour. The next one came in and did it. Oh, the concepts were explained slightly differently by a different, strategy consultancy. And they had the buzzwords and the examples from the first one. And the next one, of course, gave slightly different examples. And that half an hour discussion was a little more excited, robust, engaged. By the third time it was explained, at the end, like, we had swagger, we got it, we were with the program. And then we were talking about, well, what would be the one thing we could do in terms of digitally transforming how we use our IT knowledge of our customers and map it to our call center to actually drive better revenue and better engagement and better problem solving. So that was really helpful, and I think that worked well.
Where and how are you using AI to good effect in your boardrooms as opposed to helping the executive in the organization?
So there are lots of ecosystem partners around the corporate boardroom. And one of them, and full disclosure, I'm associated with the company, is a company named Diligent. And they make the electronic board portal initially. But now they have AI capabilities they built in to summarize content in your board book or summarize content in your committee book. They have the ability to, help drive insights and informed questions that would be a way to, prepare and gather information. And then the other way you can do it, in my opinion, what I do is I use my large language model. So you might be using ChatGPT, Gemini, Perplexity, and I do work before the board meeting on the competitive landscape. who are the outside competitors for my company? What are the innovators doing? Who might be surprise interlopers that would sneak up behind us? What might be macro trends that, I might think are going to impact the company? And how are we thinking about that? Could be autonomy. It could be robotics. It could be, energy transformation of small modular reactors. If you're, BP, how is that going to affect the consumption of oil and gas, other renewable technologies? So, doing my research so that I, have done my own thinking so that I can look at the board material with that lens.
Betsy, time is flying, but before we go on to the lightning round, I just got one last question for you around how you've gone about building your portfolio as a board member, because you have built an incredible media profile as a board member. You have written a couple of books, you've got your own website, you're a prolific writer, you're a regular guest on podcasts. Really interested to hear your thoughts and advice for board members listening about the return on the investment that you make into building that profile, or how should they think about whether do they need to go and write books and write articles and build up a sort of equivalent profile?
Well, first of all, Oliver, I'm happy to donate a digital copy of my book to all your listeners.
That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And
Thank
we'll
you.
work with you. What have I done different? I really think if you're continuously curious and trying to learn from people, when I'm helping people, I'm being mentored by them as much as I'm mentoring the other person. And, if you're always looking to learn and you're always active and engaged, I think probably the most different thing that I would recommend that has worked for me, I think, is to be very active. I don't think board work's a part-time thing. I don't think I, sit on 2 boards and I talk about it on, the 5th hole of my golf round. I do this full time. I go to conferences. I meet startup companies. I work with private equity. I work with investment banking. I, listen to podcasts.
Betsy, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
I am.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
Good to Great by Jim Collins, because it identifies that companies have a super short life cycle. 40% are gone in 20 years. Where's your company in its life cycle?
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most.
Abdication of decision-making. If there's a crisis, do not turf it to the outside lawyers and advisors. You are there to represent the shareholders. Your most important reason you're there is to make a business judgment. So make the business judgment.
A question every board should ask at least once a year.
What will kill our company? Who are the competitors that will overtake us?
A boardroom myth you think needs busting.
Super high value blue chip resumes versus the reality of the person.
Favorite quote.
Perfect is the enemy of good enough.
Piece of board advice that sounds right but is wrong.
Sticking with groupthink and going along to get along.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time, and how has that changed how you behave?
How to bring up a difficult and sticky issue in a diplomatic way, in an effective way, in a way that people can absorb.
And so what do you do differently now to what you did before?
Socialize it in private. Socialize it with your lead independent director or chairman. Socialize it with your CEO. And make sure that you're bringing it up in a way that is constructive and absorbable.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
At Lucent, I was too direct in identifying fraudulent behavior.
And so what was the lesson that you took away from that?
It would have been better to first socialize this one-on-one with the audit committee members and understand how to bring the outside accountants in to the process.
Best interview question to ask a prospective non-executive.
How busy are you? How do you spend your time? Where do you get your learnings?
And what are you looking for in the answer there?
High level of engagement, that you're active, you're working, you're aware of what's going on. You know, if you're doing board work as a part-time gig and you think your old playbook is relevant, because it was relevant for long periods of time and it didn't change that much in the 90s or 2010s or even the early 2020s. You know, if you're not 100% in it, you're not really going to be as valuable as you could be.
And finally, one thing our listeners should take away from this episode, if they take nothing else.
Never give up on your dream and always be helpful to others.
Betsy, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Great to be with you.
If you want to build real visibility and authority at board level, not just a strong private reputation, the Enter the Boardroom community gives you the platform to do it. Listeners get 10% off. Visit etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.